So I'd like to welcome you to the Project Inspire MindFlex mini-series. And this is the first of a weekly mini-series of Noah Weinberg's life-changing insights. I was a student of Rabbi Weinberg's for many years, really for over 20 years. And I remember when I went to Israel for the first time, I was taking a break from my job on Wall Street, traveling around the world, and I always wanted to go to Israel. And when I got to Israel, Project Inspire MindFlex mini-series, and this is the first of a mini-series. One second, I wonder why that's happening. I was a student of Rabbi Weinberg for many years, really for over 20 years. And I remember when I went to Israel for the first time, I was taking a break from my job on Wall Street, traveling around the world, and I always wanted to go to Israel. And when I got to Israel, let me try this again. One second. Okay, let me try this again. I think I'll be able to do it now. We had two different platforms on. So I was traveling around the world and I bumped into Asia Torah in the old city of Jerusalem. And I started taking some classes and it was a very exciting time. And I was really struck by the depth of the wisdom that Judaism had to offer. I got to Hebrew school, and to me, it was just not relevant. It was like many in my generation. I happened to go to a Reform Hebrew school, and it didn't speak to me. And when I heard the Torah in a very authentic way, in a traditional manner, it was just unbelievable. And I thought to myself, how could I have lived? I was on Wall Street. I went to an Ivy League college. I considered myself like well-read, and I studied philosophy and religion and politics in college, and I never heard of Judaism. It was almost like, and it was just mind-blowing to me. It was like that old commercial in the 90s, "This isn't my old grandfather's Chevrolet." I mean, this was a brand new animal to me. And particularly hearing the insights of Rabbi Weinberg, even brought it to another level. We just got finished with Passover, and Passover is about questions. And that's the beginning of our search for wisdom and freedom to dig deeper in life. And one of the questions asked, the simple son asked, Mazos, why? Why do we do this? And it says a simple question, but when you really think about it, it's not a simple question at all. Why is the most beautiful, most pure question. Why is the question that kids ask us all the time? Remember when your kids were 5, 6 years old and they pepper you with why? You're like, leave me alone, go watch the Discovery Channel. You shied away because long ago you stopped asking that basic question, that question why. And one thing I remember about Rabbi Weinberg was that he always had the purity of a 6-year-old, the wonder, because he said, this is God's creation. God is trying to teach me through the Torah and through the Torah in the world. And my job is to soak it up. So why is like the flashlight or the shovel, which digs down into reality for me to uncover what life's about and to connect to God. But he had the simplicity of a 6-year-old with the intellect of a genius. You put those together, you have very, very powerful and practical lessons from Torah. So I want to share with you a few that really made a difference to me. And let's just start with what I would call Rabbi Weinberg's signature approach. And that was describing how God created the world for our very pleasure. And he had a classic series that you can get even now on the h.com MP3 site, The 5 Levels of Pleasure. It was a classic analysis of why God created the world for pleasure and what are the various levels of pleasure, because there are superficial levels of pleasure and then there are very deep levels of pleasure. So I remember the longtime CEO of Asia Torah, Eric Coopersmith. He was coming similar to me. He was traveling from Europe. He had been on a professional hockey team in Switzerland. He was originally a Canadian native, very bright guy and very dynamic and capable, but a great athlete as well. And he was trying to get into the NHL. And a lot of times when you went to a team in Europe, that was kind of like a farm league to get into the NHL. So Europe obviously is very close to Israel. And he had a break from his team's hockey schedule. And he popped over to Israel. Someone must have brought him to a class of Rabbi Weinberg. Remember, picture it, this rabbi with a long white beard. One person I remember said, if he wasn't wearing black, I'd think he was Santa Claus. That's kind of what he looked like. Very jolly. And he was talking about pleasure. And he was saying that God created the world for pleasure, and that is the basic principle of Judaism. Now, many of the classic philosophers, Jewish philosophers, and the Kabbalists say this in different ways. But to Eric Coopersmith, this was a mind-blowing concept and something he couldn't believe had anything to do with Judaism, because the Judaism he knew wasn't about that at all. And it really intrigued him. And he said to himself, the rabbi's right. Life is about pleasure. But you know what? He and I seem to have very different ideas of what's pleasurable. One of us is crazy. And I'm not so sure it's him. It could be me. And that prompted him to go and to consider it much further. But Rabbi Weinberg would point, amongst other things, to the great story, the first Jew. The first Jew was Abraham. And when we meet Abraham in the Parsha Lech Lecha, God says to Abraham, he says, Lech Lecha, go you, Lech Lecha, ma'artzacha, from your land, mimoladecha, from your birthplace, u'mebeis avicha, and from the house of your father. Eta aretz asher arecha, to the land that I'm going to show you. He says, go. Now, the obvious question that the commentators asked, he throws in a superfluous word, you. It's an imperative form. When I say go, it's obvious who I'm talking to. I'm talking to you. But the Torah says, lech lecha, go you. Extra word, Rashi, the commentator, the biblical commentator, kind of jumps on it right away. And he says, you know what that you means? He says it means lahanasacha uletovasacha. Go for your pleasure, go for your good. This is the first commandment that God is giving the first Jew. Abraham was the father of the Jewish people. The very first commandment, which is a paradigm for all the commandments, are don't think when I command you to do something, it's for me. Usually when you command someone, you ask someone, you demand for something, get me your coffee. Obviously, it's for the benefit of the commander. But with God, it's the other way around. God is telling us, whenever I give you commandment, don't look what you're doing for me. It's really what I'm about to do for you. And I remember he would say brilliantly, he paraphrased John F. Kennedy's famous statement in the 60s, don't ask what your country can do for you, but rather what you could do for your country. So Rabbi Weinberg would say, don't ask what you can do for God, rather ask what you will allow God to do for you. Because he understood that God being perfect was a one-way street. God didn't need anything from us at all. He was the archetypal giver. Now, this is a mind-blowing, if you think about it, from a religious perspective, a Jewish perspective, to think that God is giving me all these commandments for me. I always thought it was the opposite way around, and it was further kind of amplified, this concept, because I only knew, me and a lot of my contemporaries, days like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which are very austere, which seem to be all about exacting a pound of flesh. Like I'm kind of paying God back for everything I did this particular year. Why he wants me to pay him back this way, I don't really know. But that's what it sounded like. There wasn't a lot of joyous occasions. I didn't go for Purim or for Shabbat or for the different things in life which have a little bit more of a pleasurable aspect to them. But to understand that God created the world for our pleasure is a mind-blowing concept. It actually turns the whole angle of Judaism around. Instead of thinking, what can I do for God? I have to think, you know what? If God gives me these mitzvot, then each one of them is for me. So the question is not, do I like them or not like them? The question is, what is the hidden benefit? What is the hidden pleasure? And I remember thinking when I started to get involved a little at the time, that particular time, I wasn't used to these pleasures. I wasn't used to spiritual pleasures. To me, praying was not something that sounded fun. If you asked me if I was a spiritual person, I would have said I'm about as spiritual as a rock. I remember on my way around the world, I was in Thailand, and I went on this massive technical rock climb up this mountain face. And I got to the top. I was in really good shape, but it was really arduous. I get to the top, and I peek over the top of this cliff, and there's this Buddhist monk in orange flowing robes at the top of this mountain. How did he get up there? I don't even know. He wasn't breaking a sweat at all. And I looked at him, and the image in my mind was, this is spiritual. Not me. I am physical. I have nothing to do with the world of spirituality. But when I got involved in Judaism, I realized that real spirituality is using the physical world and elevating it. So all these mitzvot in the Torah, many of them, most of them were physical actions, but they had a spiritual base to them. And that was a discovery. It was like discovering how a soul could live spiritually through the physical world. And the other thing that really intrigued me, similar to what Eric Cooperson thought, the future CEO of Aish Torah, was that this is what all human beings intuitively think life's about. If you ask everybody, what are they after? They're after maximizing their pleasure, whether they call it happiness. They're trying to maximize their self-interest, their pleasure, their happiness 24/7 and avoid pain. That's what they're doing. So the fact that Judaism honed down onto this main principle that every human being, you tap every man on the shoulder, you ask him, what are you living for? What's the world about? That's what he'll identify. It gives you a lot of credibility that this religion is true, that this religion is real, because it hooks up with how you feel as a person. So that gave me a tremendous amount of clarity as well. And then also what it says is everything you don't realize, you don't think about, you don't know that's going to be pleasurable, like praying is an example. Just wait it out. Just look a little bit deeper, ask the why questions, and it will actually come to you. And it's funny because I really enjoy praying. I really enjoy talking to God. I recognized I had a spiritual side that I just didn't know existed before. It was almost like a person who, when they're young, you give them a glass of wine versus we used to call it bug juice, that very sugary, juice that you get in camp. They'll always take the bug juice, the real sugary cereal, the sugary soda or drink. But when they get older, they want the wine because it has deeper pleasure. And that's what Judaism's about. There's a lot of deeper pleasure, very much like a wine connoisseur knows the deeper pleasure in wine. That's what Judaism has to offer. There's one other thing that I wanted to mention about pleasure, which was another subtle point Rabbi Weinberg would often say, which made a tremendous difference to me, and I think it's a game changer. He would say there's a counterfeit pleasure out there that everyone unfortunately goes after, or is very geared or weighted to go after. And he would bring it up in the following manner. He would say, what is the opposite of pain? What's the opposite of pain? Now, 9 out of 10 people, maybe even 95 out of 100 would say the opposite of pain is pleasure. It's an equation. The opposite of pain is pleasure. And he would point out, he'd say, no, that's, I get it. Most people think that's really not true. The opposite of pain is no pain. The opposite of pain is no pain. Now, what word do we use generally for no pain? One word that kind of describes that, he would say it's comfort. The opposite of pain is comfort. Now, people think that comfort's pleasure, and that's the confusion. And I would put it like this. Imagine you're in your car, and you're in the middle of the summer, and your air conditioner is broken. Now, unfortunately, it happens to me an awful lot. And I'm in pain, sweating, it's horrible, it's, humid. Anyway, when I go get the Freon, the injection of Freon, the air conditioning system's fixed, when the air comes on, I wouldn't say that I'm in pleasure at that point. I would say that I'm in the absence of pain. I'm comfortable. Really, true pleasure, the price tag for true pleasure typically is pain or struggle or effort. I know it's a pejorative word in our culture, But if you think about it, if I ask you what are the greatest 5 pleasures of your life, usually it'll be things you invested yourself in. Like we say in the gym, no pain, no gain. We all know that if you get down to it, struggle and effort is typically the price tag for the greatest pleasures in life. If people are trying for comfort, want the easy life, want the hammock with the pina colada on the beach, just about asleep, that's the ultimate in comfort. If that's what life becomes for any of us, if that's our goal, one thing I can guarantee you, you will never get real enduring pleasure in life. You'll always be a little empty. Unfortunately, that is a lot of people's end game of retirement is just that. Stop all the pain, stop all the trouble. I want to just coast. When you coast on a cardiogram, that's called flatline. That means you're dead. That's not really good. So the game-changing piece of wisdom here is that life's about pleasure. Mitzvahs are about pleasure. Don't get fooled going after comfort than when you really want is pleasure. Think of life as a chess game where the goal is not to be comfortable and not think, but to take on the pain of the struggle and the thinking about the next move. And the idea would be take pleasure in the destination. Don't get caught up in the pain of the gym. Keep your eye on the goal, on the brass ring. That's the first piece of wisdom. Second piece of wisdom, which is similar, another bombshell, another life-changing, game-changing piece of wisdom. It really starts from the definition of God that the Jewish people brought to the world. When you think about monotheism, which the Jewish people are typically credited for, the idea of monotheism is that there's one God. What the Jewish people meant by this concept of one God is we brought a concept of God is one, meaning God is perfect. Oneness meaning everythingness. We say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. We say that God is the one everythingness that threads through all of life and all of creation. Perfection, infinity. That's the new novel understanding the Jewish people brought from God, and our religion is based on that lockstep, because you'll understand pleasure comes from that concept. If God doesn't need anything, if he is as rich, so to speak, as Donald Trump, I don't need to give him a loan, just as Donald would never ask me to give him a loan. It's nonsensical. So when you understand that God is perfect, that there is a Jewish God in the world and God is one, he wants our pleasure. Similarly, God didn't need to create the world. And the Jewish philosophers ask, why did God create the world? If he doesn't need anything, if he's perfect, what could have been his rationale for creating the world? And they say there could only be one answer. And that perfection, God, all he wanted to do was give. Very much like a parent, they want to give altruistically to their children. God is the parent on high, and God wants to give to his children. So he creates a world, a hospitality in, to give to us. Now, what I would call this, it really is the definition of altruism, because even though parents are the closest we know of altruism, they still have their own needs. But if God has no needs, he is the proverbial one-way street. So he creates this world, it creates it as an act of love, an act of giving. I say it's the original and the longest running love story in the world. Every other love story is a corollary of this original love story. Now, everybody wants love, and people realize that kind of love is what the world's really about. All you need is love. It's a song, but it's really true. Now, but most people can't define love or a lot of other concepts. What pleasure really is, what's free will, what's freedom. The blow-away thing about Judaism that I love so much is that Judaism gives definitions for these concepts. Most people, if you ask them about love, they'll say, I can't define it. I just know when I'm in it. I know when I'm in love. Now, if that's the case, how can you ever get to these beautiful concepts? And more so, the Torah actually commands us to love God and to love your fellow Jews. Now, how could you be commanded to do something you have no definition for? And even more so, how can you command an emotion? How do I summon up an emotion on command? So Rabbi Weinberg would point out a definition of love. Staggering. It really comes from Maimonides, and his description of the mitzvah of loving God. And he would say that loving God depends on knowledge of God. The more you know, the more you love. It's like a mathematical equation. So why is it a mathematical equation? And the idea flows from what we just said. If God is perfect, that means it's all virtue, all good, all love, nothing negative, nothing fractured, nothing bad, all virtue. So love is produced when I recognize God's virtue and attribute that to him. In other words, we have these euphemisms, mother time, father time, mother nature, and it's really kind to say these parental analogies for this world, because the world's loving, the world's giving like a mother, the world's protective like a father, the world is beautiful, the world is loving. But if we attribute the magic of the world to father time and to mother nature, not to God, we'll never grow to love God. But imagine, the more we know of this world, the more knowledge of this world, which is God hiding behind the curtain, the more we will love God. Knowledge of God equals love, lockstep. I know what he does for me, I'm going to love him. Just like anybody, if you paid attention how much your mother and your father loved you and did for you, and you really appreciate it, you're filled with love for them. Same thing with God. So Rabbi Weinberg would say, for people, it's a little trickier because God is all virtue. But he would derive the definition of love for you and me and everyone else. And it was as follows. Love is the emotional pleasure of recognizing virtue in another human being and identifying him with that virtue, meaning he is that virtue. And if you think about it, take anybody that you love, identify this person. The reason why we always love people is because they're sensitive and they're kind and they love me and they're giving and they're courageous. Those are the reasons we love people. Now, if you ask the person, if you say to yourself, the person that I love, do they have any faults? Do they ever wake up on the wrong side of the bed? And you say, of course they do. Of course they do. Now imagine we focused on their faults rather than their virtue. Then we wouldn't love them. Think about anybody you don't like. And if I ask you, why don't you like them? You will come up with their faults. Now, each of us is a mixed bag of faults, of vices and virtue. Love is the choice to focus on virtue. That's a staggering and practical definition. And he would often try to prove this. He would say, God gave us an amazing analogy to teach us how to love all human beings. And that analogy is children. He would say that a person is pre-programmed to see the virtue of his child. And he would say it amusing, it's kind of a story to illustrate this. He would say, if you go to your neighbor who's pregnant, if she's going to love her child that she's about to have, she would look at you as if you're crazy. And you would say to her, what are you talking about? Your child might grow up like the Greenberg kid down the block, those obnoxious kids. Maybe you should get to know your kid a little, see if he's worth, as a keeper before you get too attached to him. And the woman would laugh, what are you, you're nuts. But what he's trying to illustrate is that the only reason we don't do that is because we have an inborn attachment to our child. We're going to love them automatically. Now, it's funny because we don't have that same commitment to other people. Even take our spouses who we choose to marry. At one point, we saw their virtue. And we saw their virtue in, very large, and whatever vices they had, pretty small. We identified them with the virtue. But we didn't realize that over time, we had to be committed to seeing their virtue, or else we'd fall out of love with them. The key to loving another human being, Rabbi Weinberg would say, is to be committed to seeing virtue. That is unbelievable, because that is the key to why God can command us to love him and to love other people. He's not saying sum up an emotion. He's saying you've got to be committed. All you need is commitment to see virtue, to see virtues of the world of God, and to see virtues of other people, and you will love them. And love is a fabulous pleasure. It's a pleasure we're all looking for, and it's the key to life because we're modeling God's behavior. So this was the second, in my opinion, game-changing piece of wisdom, a definition for love that's practical and a pathway to really start looking at other people and generating more love in your life. And I'll tell you, if you start looking at the virtue of people that annoy you, all of a sudden they kind of look at you like as a mirror, and they will start responding to your changed attitude, and you'll generate them to as well love you. And that's the beginning to peace. That's the beginning to love of all humanity. That's number two. The third piece of, game-changing wisdom, and again, every one of these pieces you can have an entire class or more on, but I'm trying to boil down for you the essence. So one of the most foundational concepts of Judaism is free will. The earliest source, I guess you would say, in the Bible is that we're created Tselem Elokim, the image of God. And many commentators say that means just like God's a creator, we also have choice and we create as well. We have free will. It's fascinating because the Kabbalah and the Jewish philosophers say animals don't have free choice, they're programmed, and angels don't have free choice. Angels are spiritual beings that do God's will, God's yes men, so to speak. And an animal is pre-programmed and they fight. And it's the unique combination of animal and angel, body and soul, which gives us the ability to have free will, to want to go in one direction and to want to go in another direction. The battle of free will is the battle between the body and the soul. Long discussion, great class Rabbi Weinberg has called 5 Levels of Free Will, which goes into this in great depth. But what I want to focus on is the definition that he would point out from the Torah about free will. Because most of us would actually, and if I asked you what free will is, most of us would say it's the choice of good and evil, meaningful or not, good and bad, doing things that are meaningful, not meaningful. But if you go to the Torah, it's very interesting. In the last Parsha, Nitzavim, right at the end, and this is right before Rosh Hashanah, by the way, because Rosh Hashanah really is the birthday of free will. And the Torah says, see, I've placed before you today the life and the good and the death and the evil. Life, good, death, evil. Life and death, good and evil. Obviously, life goes with good, death goes with evil. It also later on says, I've placed life and death before you, blessing and curse. Again, blessing goes with life and good, and curse goes with death and bad. I place this all before you. You shall choose life so that you will live and your children after you. Now, Rabbi Weinberg always pointed out that everyone wants to do good. Even Hitler, if you asked him, was he doing good? He would say, absolutely. Killing the Jewish people is good for humanity. Everybody thinks they're doing good, even when they're doing tremendous evil. Now, good and blessing go together. Curse and evil go together. Everyone understands they're trying to be good. That's not the obvious, the real essence of free will. The essence of free will is in the first part, life and death. And we can even see this because in the end, the Torah says, choose life. The Torah ignores the other 2 points. Choose life so you live. And Rabbi Weinberg would say, first of all, he points out, that's fascinating. Who would have thought that free will choice is between life and death? I would have thought, like I said before, it's good and evil, meaning and meaninglessness, but life and death? And the Torah says something that seems funny. I would have thought that unless I choose death, choose suicide, I'm alive. The Torah says, no, choose life so you will live, implying that if you don't make an active choice of life, you're really dead. Now, how are we supposed to understand that? And he would point out the final exit, someone that's really choosing death, to illustrate what the Torah is talking about. He said, God forbid, we should never be in this situation. We should have tremendous mercy on anybody who would be pushed to this. But he would ask us, what is the reason, if you boil it down, that people would choose suicide? Very small amount of people, but any amount's too many. But what's the reason? And we would always come down to, it's escaping pain. The person's in an incredible amount of pain. There's a loss of perspective, and the pain overwhelms everything else. And he would say it was really an escape from pain. That's what it was about. And then he would say, my friends, we might not take this final exit to really get rid of all our pain. But don't we commit suicide in installments, little installments here and there? It even has crept into our language. We kill time, we zombie out, we're dead drunk, we're spaced out. What it means is there are times in our life where we don't want to engage fully in the pain of living. So free will, he would say to us, is something which is operable 24/7. And this is another fascinating point, because when you think about free will as good and evil, how many times during the day do you actually access good and evil, or even meaning and meaninglessness? But the choice of engaging in life or disengaging, I mean, that we can all relate to, is a constant choice. Am I going to do the same thing at work today as I did yesterday? Am I going to improve myself and learn some wisdom today? Am I going to work out, get healthy? Am I going to keep growing in my character? Or am I just going to keep going with the decisions I've made for the last 10, 20 years? Am I just going to put the radio station on in my commute to work? Or am I going to listen to a book on an MP3? If you look at free will that way, it's amazing because it's constant. Now, put your God hat on for a minute. If you were God and free will was the key to greatness, that power pack God gave every one of us to model him, to actually become gods through our own effort and to earn reward and earn our own perfection that way. Wouldn't he have given it to us in a way which it can be accessed every single second of your entire life? That's mind-blowing. That's what Rabbi Weinberg would point out, that free will is operable at all times in our life. All times in our life. And he would say, I remember he would say, I had an analogy. Imagine you're in a bus, and in Israel they have these buses that go for an hour. You're in a bus, and a guy has a stack of $100 bills on his lap. He's next to the window. Window's open, and every 30 seconds he throws $100 out of the window. And then at the end, when the stack's down to nothing, he turns to you and he says, do you have a few hundreds that I can borrow? And you say, are you crazy? You just threw them out the window. Well, Rabbi Weinberg would say, that's what we do when we go to God on Rosh Hashanah. And you say, can you give me another year of life? Can you give me another stack of $100 bills so that I can unfortunately throw it out the window? Now, he would give a very practical definition of free will as well, that this is also worth the price of admission. He said free will is the choice between doing what you feel like doing and doing what you want to do. Meaning the choice of life or death. Death is the comfort. Death is what I feel like doing in the moment, the disengagement, the mollifying the body. I really want to be healthy and to lose weight. I feel like eating the chocolate cake. I really want to be sensitive and patient to my kids, particularly when I'm cooped up, in COVID-19. It's fraying my nerves, but you know what I want to do? When I'm lucid and clear before I go to bed, I want to be loving. I want to be courageous. I want to be. Those are the lists of what you want. But in the moment, I feel like snapping. I feel like getting my work done and not having to deal with the machinations of what's going on in my house. So Rabbi Weinberg would say each one of us has various free will struggles. I have free will struggles around food. My wife doesn't at all. She has her own free will struggles. Some people have free will struggles about anger or about impatience or about not being confrontational. Sometimes people need to be confrontational to stick up for themselves. They're like kind of get run over. So the question is, what are your free will struggles? What are the things that you really want to do in life? And what are the things that trip you up, the things that you feel like doing? I want to be patient with my mother when she asks me about her taxes or about her finances. And that's what I want. I feel like saying, Mom, what are you worried about? I talked to you about this last week. That's a free will struggle for me. I want to be healthy and to be fit. I feel like overeating. I want to be able to manage my anxiety. I feel like drinking it away. Each one of us probably has 3 or 5 free will struggles, but realize if you don't know what they are and how they speak to you, the feel like versus the want, you'll be ambushed every time. and you'll confuse what the soul really wants for what the body really feels like. So free will and knowing you have is a game changer. It's not 6 times a day with good and bad. It's every single moment. Engage in life, disengage in life. Life and death, like Hamlet. To be or not to be, that is the question every minute of my life. And then how does it break down practically? My free will struggles, what I feel like doing versus what I want to do. If you can do what you want to do more often than what you feel like doing, you will be a great person. And not only that, you'll be a moral person. The Torah says that the tzaddik falls down, the righteous person falls down 7 times, vayakam, and gets up, and the evil person falls down once and quits. It's fascinating. Evil is not the direct choice of doing bad. It starts by quitting or staying in the game. The righteous person, if you just stay in the game, you fall down, you did what you felt like doing versus what you wanted to do one too many times, you dust yourself off, you get up. If you get up enough times, you will become a great and will become a righteous person. Okay, that's number 3. Number 4, Rabbi Weinberg was very involved with 6 mitzvahs in the Torah. And the 6 mitzvahs in the Torah that he was involved with are called the Sheish Mitzvahs Tamidi. There are 6 constant mitzvot in the Torah, obligations that are incumbent upon us always. Most people don't even know that's the case. But these mitzvahs are mitzvahs of thought, of God consciousness, which we can fulfill every single moment of the day. Most mitzvahs you cannot fulfill every minute of the day. A couple of weeks ago, we ate the matzah on Passover. That was a mitzvah for that time. We put up a mezuzah on our door when we get a house. We will give tzedakah when we get money, but it's not a mitzvah incumbent upon us constantly. But there are 6 mitzvahs incumbent upon us all the time. The first one is to know and believe there's a God. The second mitzvah is to not have any other gods, idolatry. The third mitzvah is to know God is one. The fourth and the fifth are 2 emotional aspects of God, love of God and fear of God. And the last is don't go after the things which take you away from God. Ego and desire. Those are the 6 constant mitzvos. So the second mitzvah is don't have any idols, idol worship. And Rabbi Weinberg would say to us, today we don't really have idols. We don't really bow down to them. God and the prophets say that God took that away from us a long time ago. But philosophically, what are our idols? And our idols are things that we give power to, things that we quote unquote worship. I like to say that everybody worships something. You can worship God, you can worship yourself, you can worship money. Man is a worshiping creature. He's going to worship something. Make sure what you worship is real. So if the idea of idol worship is giving power to things that really don't have power, Rabbi Weinberg would say, you know what idol worship of our time is? And he would say the idol worship of our time is saying, I can't. I can't is believing in idols. Now, why is that? So he would explain. If God, who's the unlimited, all-powerful, almighty, he can do anything he wants. He can give you any ability you might have. Is there anything you really can't do? And people will say, of course, when they be knocked into their senses, of course they would say that's true. Previously, they would say that my abilities define my capability, meaning I see what my abilities are and I decide I'm capable of X based on my abilities. Rabbi Weinberg would say, that's always going to sell yourself short because you'll never transcend that which you think you can't do. But if you know there's a God in the world that can help you do anything, you know that your capabilities can transcend your abilities. And that's called a miracle. And the Jewish people have always been a people of miracle, and we've always transcended what the natural world would say we were capable of. In every endeavor, human endeavor in life, from economics to military might to whatever you want to say, to impact in terms of wisdom, our capabilities were never defined by our ability. So it was a very nice idea, a very life-changing idea. But Rabbi Weinberg would take it even deeper. And he would say, you know what idol worship really is? You might think it's saying I can't, but idol worship is really saying I can. People are like, what? I can? I can't understand. How is idol worship I can? And he would point out in a tremendously deep way, he would say the only reason you think there are things you can't do is because you think there are things you can do. The root of I can't is based on I can, but it's much more subtle and much more insidious. I can is based on the belief that you make things happen in the world. And really, it's not just that God will help you, but God gives you the power to lift your finger. I might have my free will say, you know what? I want to lift my finger now, but God has given me that power to do so. It's a fake out because I think it's up to me. And the way, we say it, it's said in English, better in Hebrew, better in Yiddish rather, but in English it's God proposes, man disposes. Meaning I decide. That's when my free will starts and ends. One person once told me it's like the choice to grunt or not to grunt, to be engaged or to disengage. God does everything else. Now, when I realize that my powers come from God, that's the only way I'll ever not get stuck in the I can'ts. If I realize all my power comes from the Almighty, there's nothing I can't do. There's nothing I won't undertake. And that, by the way, is why he decided to do a crazy thing 40, 50 years ago to reach out to people who were far away from the tradition and teach them Torah. Everybody thought he was nuts. You don't know how to raise money. You don't know how to create an organization. He was a scholar. What did he know? And he said, if God really can do anything and all my powers are really based on that, there's no amount of power he didn't give me. I think his Torah's Chaim, his instructions for living, his incredible way of delivering Torah is a proof of the idea that once you undertake the responsibility, that provides the capability. The ability doesn't translate to capability. Responsibility translates to capability. He gave a great analogy. The analogy would be a very famous analogy. He would say, there are cranes all over Israel, and there's building going on like crazy. It is, and truthfully, we go out on the porch of the yeshiva in the old city, and you see cranes everywhere, and it's the most beautiful sight. He said, that crane is swinging and bringing in thousands of pounds of building material. And right before it gets to the ground, there's a guy, a man or two, and he's guiding the pallet into place. He says, if you were a child and you were just seeing the guy, like you're on the ground and you don't have a vision of the train, you would think this guy is Samson. You would incorrectly assume that this fellow is the strength, the ability behind the crane. He says, that's the mistake we make. We think we're the ones swinging the pallet into place with our own might. If we understand that God's the crane and he can lift thousands of pounds beyond what we could ever do, and all we have to do is put it into place, there's nothing we wouldn't undertake. And he would also say, quite interestingly, I remember him saying this once, imagine going to Las Vegas. And people play slot machines. Every once in a while, it's very exciting when you see a person win the slot machine, and then all the coins come flooding out, and they try to take the bucket and put it under there to catch all the coins. He said, you know what I do? He said, I'm like a guy, and all I do is keep putting in quarters, or tokens, and I pull the lever, and I hit jackpots, and I just put my hands under and collect the money. And he would laugh, quote unquote, all the way to the bank. He says, it's not me. If I thought it was me generating this money and doing this, I would have quit a long time ago. The last thing I want to mention was also something tremendously powerful. This is the fifth piece of life-changing wisdom that the Rosh Hashiva, the Rabbi Weinberg, taught me and all his other students. He would always say, what are you living for? There's a famous classic of Jewish thought, Mesilas Yesharim. In the beginning, it says you have to clarify your obligations in the world and what your purpose is. Now, coming from a secular background, that in and of itself was very interesting to me, that there really was purpose. And then it was written what that purpose was. A lot of people, I think, just think that life happens on its own. There's not necessarily a purpose. You create a purpose that you want to create, and every one of it has a different purpose. But from a Jewish context, yes, even though we do have different abilities, we have a different way into make our contribution, we have one overarching purpose, national purpose, purpose as a community, as a kehillah, as a family unit, and on a personal level. But there is a purpose. That in and of itself was very interesting. And he would say, what are you living for? And most people really didn't know. And I remember when I was in college, you know, as I mentioned before, studied philosophy, studied religion, and I talked to my friends a lot. And it was an intellectual group of people. And I remember one time traveling on the way back from like a spring break in the car, the subject came up, is there anything you'd be willing to die for? And we grew up, it was not very far after the Vietnam War was over, 5, 6, 7 years after Vietnam was over. So it was right in the rearview mirror, very, very fresh. And there was a kind of an understanding, a feeling that that was a war that many people really didn't feel it was worth dying for. And we were thinking about it. The question was posed, is there anything you'd be willing to die for? And at the time, as young men, we didn't have families, maybe we would have said, you know, our kids or our wife, we felt, you know, there really wasn't anything out there worth dying for. And I remember feeling sad when I said that, or when I realized that was the end of our discussion. Because I guess I intuited deep down, or years later, I reconstructed it, and I intuited that if there was nothing worth dying for, that meant there was nothing truly worth living for. It was a fascinating concept. I mean, life wasn't that meaningful. The more meaningful it was, the more you'd be willing to sacrifice for it, and even potentially pay the ultimate sacrifice. And Rabbi Weimer would point to the famous story, the binding of Isaac, the Akedas Yitzchak. And we all know the story, and God commanded Abraham to sacrifice Yitzchak, and then he stopped him at the last minute. And Rabbi Weimer would say, the story's teaching you the following. You all think God wants you to sacrifice your life for him, for religion. And you know, many of the other religions do that. Kamikaze pilots, suicide bombers. That the ultimate price is to sacrifice your life. What God's teaching us is not to sacrifice your life, but know what you're willing to die for. Abraham understood he was willing to die, and Yitzhak as well, Isaac as well, his son, was willing to die for a closeness to God, to follow God's will. There's a lot to say about it, but they knew what they were willing to die for. And God says, you know what? I don't want you to die for it, but I want you to know what you're willing to die for. And I want you to live for it. Know what you're willing to die for, not so you have to die. That's not our religion. Because if you don't know what you're willing to die for, it's like life is like playing with Monopoly money. You're never going to get serious. You're never really going to live. And then what I want you to do is live for it. And if you're going to live for it, enjoy it. Know what you're willing to die for. Don't die for it. Live for it and enjoy it. Because he would see a lot of religious people, even the guys in the yeshiva, and we'd get involved in it, and we would get distracted by the effort and the struggle. We'd focus on the pain. And we'd walk around like martyrs, like kind of carrying the yoke for God, as if God wanted us to do that. And he would laugh and he would try to poke fun at it for us to realize the insanity of moping around for the ability to engage in life and fulfill your purpose. And he would tell us, you got to focus on the pleasure, not the pain. It's like the guy in the gym. If he doesn't focus on the gold medal, if he's only focused on the pain, he's done. He would give us an analogy. We thought it was a brilliant analogy. He would say, let guys go out on a hot summer day, young teenagers, and they're playing basketball, 90 degrees. They might play for 2 hours. Psychologist comes on the court and wants to do an experiment, gives each kid, I'll give you $50 a piece if you run and jump and you defend each other. One thing though, I'm going to take the ball away. Do the same thing, run, jump, sweat, call out the coverages, whatever it is, I'm taking the ball away. He said, how long do you think those guys are going to last? The same guys that can do 2 hours, no problem. He says, if they last 10 minutes, they're going to be lucky. Why? Because there's no pleasure, there's no brass ring, there's no goal to distract them from the pain. He says, that's us in life. He said, the key to life is knowing what you're living for. If you don't know what you're living for, you just get caught up in what's going on at the moment. And you only have one life to live. It's an opportunity of a lifetime. Okay, so these are the 5, pieces I feel of life-changing wisdom that Rabbi Weinberg taught. That pleasure is what God created the world for. Judaism is all about pleasure. Pleasure is something we intuitively realize life's about. Don't get caught up in thinking comfort is true pleasure. If life's about comfort, you will never get to true pleasure. Free will, that's the engine for us to be great. It's not the choice of good and evil. It's the choice of life and death. Engage in life, disengage from life. The more we engage, the more we live. The greater we become. The more we disengage, space out, shirk that responsibility, shirk that opportunity, the less great people we're going to become. Free will, very practically, is doing what you want to do more often than what you feel like doing. What you really want versus what you feel like. The more often you do what you want to do versus what you feel like doing, the greater person you'll become. Define your essential free will struggles so you don't get ambushed. The 4th piece of life-changing wisdom is to understand that giving power to yourself, what you can and you can't do, that makes you small in life. That holds you back. If you realize everything's a gift from the Almighty, there's nothing you can't do with his help, then your capabilities will not be defined by your abilities. They will be defined by taking responsibility. And the last, maybe even the most important, is what are you living for? If you don't know what you're living for, have a real reason to live, an enduring reason to live, you're just fooling around and you're never really going to get true and serious pleasure in life. And you're never going to have a shot at getting to fulfill your ultimate potential because you're just kind of bumping around where life takes you. Hope you enjoyed this. When I teach these lessons, it reinforces these within me and it fires me up because they're practical and they're about life and they're about being successful. And the more we can take these to heart, the more we can be tremendously, tremendously successful. And thank you for listening. I hope you really enjoyed the 3-part Mindflex series on Rabbi Noah Weinberg's insights. Next week and the week after, we're going to be hosting a fantastic and a famous program called Discovery. The Discovery Seminar has been one of the best seminars which explores the rational basis for God and Torah through many different avenues, from science, from psychology, from history. It's not to be missed. Next week are the first 3 episodes, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of next week. And the week after that, going back to our main schedule, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Good night, everybody. Good Shabbos.